After years of honing their skills with endless gigs across Europe, the Beatles were just about ready to implant themselves within the public consciousness with Please Please Me. This gang of rock and roll obsessed Liverpudlians would begin to meld into something far more presentable, of course, with the help of Brian Epstein and George Martin. Something more mainstream, polished, presentable. And the time was just right, and the USA rock and roll was in crisis. Elvis had been drafted, Little Richard had found God, Chuck Berry was doing time, and Jerry Lee Lewis was doing his cousin. And it was fertile ground for something new and invigorating, drawing from the paradigms of classic rock and roll, but giving it a Mersey beat twist. Lennon and McCartney at this time had crafted the initial core of songs that would provide the foundation for the most legendary songwriting partnership of all time, and the foundation for this wonderful, wonderful album. And the remaining songs were drawn from a whole spectrum of different influences, from black soul music, pop, girl groups, even show tunes. Mark Kemp, writing for Pace, commended the group for blending African American musical styles with chirpy harmonies from girl groups such as the Shirelles, for example, creating a sound the pop world had never heard before. These songs, of course, were pruned from their live sets, played mostly at Liverpool's The Cavern Club, the same venue where the album was originally supposed to be recorded. George Martin wanted Please Please Me to be a live album, one that reflected the energy of the live band. And the title track still sounds as fresh today as it did then. Then you get the unstoppable energy of I Saw Her Standing There. This is primal rock and roll that would go on to define music for the next 6 decades. This album's live feel makes Please Please Me feel a more coherent and conceptual listening experience, more so than those other cover-heavy Beatles albums. The reason being is that the covers on this album work brilliantly, not just as filler, but as markers for style and effect. These songs were also stylistic stepping stones. McCartney would go on to write songs whose drama and emotional nuance would eclipse A Taste of Honey, for example. But for this record, he takes on the corny melodrama of that number and makes it work. The success of Please Please Me as a song necessitated the recording of an album, one that was recorded in 10 hours with ragged vocals and high expectations. But the album's energy and freshness is attributed to its intense origins. As the songs rush past, it's easy to get wrapped up in the sound of the record itself without realising how the album effectively summarises the band's eclectic influences. There's a love of girl groups, vocal harmonies, sophisticated popcraft, schmaltz, R&B and hard-driving rock and roll, which is enough to make Please Please Me fairly impressive as far as I'm concerned. Misery and There's a Place grow out of the girl group tradition, but without being tied to it. The Beatles at this point were born interpreters. You can feel their character and their charisma honed over 1,000,000 nights in 1,000,000 shitty clubs emanating from the speakers. Original numbers like Do You Want to Know a Secret and the pleasantly light P.S. I Love You have not aged well, but are still endearing, infused as they are with a kind of a cheerful innocence and enthusiasm. And John's early lyrical musings kind of serve as a foreshadowing of what was to come later on in songs like There's a Place. Let's not forget McCartney's snaking bass line on I Saw Her Standing There. Please Please Me is pure pop genius, and its sophisticated middle eight is a signpost of what was to come. This album just oozes charm from its humour and its harmonies, from the doe-eyed balladeering of Paul's A Taste of Honey to John's throat shredding on the feral Twist and Shout. It's a potent pointer to the psychosexual frenzy that would become Beatlemania. Interestingly, NME described this album in a retrospective review as anarchy you could take home to mum, rock and roll that is about fuck all and absolutely everything at the same time. The approach was practical and economical. They wanted to get this album done in a day, which was a tall order for an untested band, studio-wise at least. But something more seismic was occurring during the recording of this album. It was the sound of popular music changing permanently. George Martin wanted this to be a live album, as he felt this was where the band's appeal was. He was still somewhat dubious about them as songwriters. I think what they were really looking for was another Cliff in the Shadows, which was the industry standard at the time. It was certainly a bit of a bumpy time for the band. Most of the major labels had passed. You've got to remember, in London at the time, the major labels were EMI, Decca, Pine, Philips, which to do business with. EMI's subsidiary labels, Columbia and HMV, had also passed. It wasn't looking great. Let's not forget Decca's Dick Rowe had famously turned down this band, making what many see now as perhaps the biggest faux pas in music history. Brian Epstein, desperately doing the rounds, had provoked the interest of Sid Coleman, the general manager of Ardmore and Beechwood, who expressed interest in acquiring the publishing rights to the Beatles' original songs. Brian promised to explore it, but at that time he said that a recording contract was more crucial to his agenda. Desperate for a label, John Lennon had actually suggested Embassy, which was Woolworth's in-house label, devoted to novelty and children's records. Not sure if John was being entirely serious there. However, it was Coleman who picked up the phone and called George Martin. Brian Epstein had touted the Beatles at Parlophone's office on Manchester Square. George Martin, however, had previewed the band's Decca tape and felt that they were rather unpromising with tired and mediocre material. It was eventually Martin who would offer a contract that wasn't much of a contract really. It was more of a retainer while he checked them out. On May the 9th, 1962, he arranged an audition date for a few days after the Beatles had returned from Hamburg. The band had a set of 32 songs that Brian Epstein had selected from their repertoire, and the band breezed through them all. Interestingly, record producer Ron Richards, who was actually famed for discovering the Hollies, wasn't impressed. He said the songs were not interesting and the musicianship was adequate at best. Although Richards did express an interest in Please Please Me, he did feel that it was far too slow and too plaintive. Of course, John Lennon had fashioned this number on Roy Orbison's Only the Lonely. In terms of the audition, Ron Richards said that they handled themselves well, but they heard nothing that really excited him, and engineer Norman Smith agreed. But it was Richards that complained that the drummer was no good and needed to be replaced. Previously, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, featuring drummer Richard Starkwell, were doing the Butland circuit. Rory wanted a new image for the band and suggested a Wild West theme. Johnny Byrne became Johnny Guitar, Charlie O'Brien metamorphosised in Ty Bryan, Wally Eggman adopted the name Lou Walters, Richie Starkwell became Rings, in deference to his penchant for flashy jewellery, eventually amending it to Johnny Ringo after the mythical Gunslinger, which was rejected by the way. However, Ringo would have a drum solo in the set, which he always used to introduce as Ringo Star Time, and the name stuck. Ringo had actually stood in for Pete Best when he was ill, but this time, of course, Ringo was actually poached for the Beatles. His Liverpool debut was on August the 19th, 1962, as the crowd, loyal to Pete Best, chanted, "Pete forever, Ringo never." That afternoon, the Beatles rehearsed 6 songs, and 2 had been selected to record, Love Me Do and How Do You Do It. This was a song that George Martin had selected for them. Got to remember, in those days, bands tended to record songs that were put in front of them by their producers, polished professionals that wanted material that reflected the ethos of the label. As I said, Martin did not have any faith in this band as songwriters. He didn't see anything in their material that contradicted that. And he recorded Love Me Do as a concession to the band that were begging him to allow them to record their own material. He felt it would be kind of an adequate B-side. Martin was determined that the Beatles' first single would be How Do You Do It, a song that had formula written all over it. Interestingly, during the recording of Love Me Do, they identified Ringo's drums to be a problem. According to Norman Smith, he didn't have quite enough push and the drums were too muddy, not precise enough. So Martin and Richards decided to call in Kenny Clare, who was a top session drummer at the time. They were also toyed with the idea of changing the name of the band to Paul McCartney and the Beatles or John Lennon and the Beatles. They wanted a frontman out there as a focus of attention, a bit like Cliff Richard and the Shadows once more. On September the 11th, the Beatles returned to Abbey Road and recorded another version of Love Me Do. Ringo was stunned and devastated upon learning that a session drummer had been brought in to replace him. The aforementioned Kenny Clare, however, was unavailable, but Ron Richards had booked another big band veteran, 32-year-old Andy White. Ringo was not in the least pacified when they asked him to play tambourine and maracas on the track. The Beatles cut Love Me Do, featuring a nifty harmonica riff by John, and its flip side P.S. I Love You, a little under 2 hours, with Ron Richards at the helm. The Beatles badgered George Martin to reconsider Please Please Me. They insisted that they'd revamped it, and of course they had. They'd dropped all that kind of dreary maudlin Roy Orbison stuff and totally sort of energised it. George Martin identified it as something special with that cascading harmonica riff, soaring harmonies, and the convulsion of come-ons with turned up enough tension and desire with just a hint at suggestiveness.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on.
Was enough to convince George Martin that this was worth recording. If I may quote from Bob Spitz's book, Beatles, A Biography, Please Please Me was the world's real introduction to the Beatles. It was a stark concentration of the band's emerging sound. Catchy melodies, clever lyrics, seamless three-part harmonies, nimble instrumentation and dynamic chords dropped into patterns that transformed a tired form. We can't underplay the importance of John's vocals here, but it was very ragged and raw form. Admittedly, he had a terrible cold when he made this record, but it serves as a wonderful, almost counterpoint to Paul's mellifluous tones. And Paul's bass lines were already shaping up to be the dramatic presence in this band that they were later to become. And Ringo, the much maligned Ringo, provides a perfectly detailed backbeat, which just bursts loose at the end of the song in this crisp, percussive foray. I believe this song to be the spark that lit the fuse of Beatlemania, not I Saw Her Standing There or All My Loving. This song was a rejection of all the saccharine and mawkish pop that had clogged the British charts for years. As I said, Lennon had turned up at the studio with a dreadful cold one he'd picked up on the Helen Shapiro tour. They decided to lay down the rhythm sections first before putting the vocals on them, and this was to help create that live sound that Martin so much wanted for this band. Paul actually pushed for the band doing Falling in Love Again, the over-stylised Marlene Dietrich number, but George Martin, thankfully, talked him out of it. When they got to Misery and There's a Place and 17, it was evident that these numbers were more fully developed and better crafted and rhythmically textured, allowing for dramatic shifts in the melodies and transitions, and suited to all sorts of imaginative orchestration. They cut There's a Place, a track pinched from West Side Story, and the interlocking harmonies took about 10 takes in all. And there's a sweet coming together of the voices here, climaxing over the dramatic finish, riding over John's harmonica. Lennon struggles to stay with Paul on this number simply due to he wasn't well, and he kind of growls the bottom part of the duet. 17 was the number the Beatles had been performing to great acclaim since Hamburg. She was just 17 and she'd never been a beauty queen. Both Lennon and McCartney agreed that the second line didn't work. The replacement line, however, speaks of the off-the-cuffness shorthand of disaffected youth. You know what I mean. It just fitted perfectly, so they retitled the song I Saw Her Standing There.
1, 2, 3, 4!
I love the way Paul counts off the number before the raspy, suggestive vocals, twangy rhythmic guitars, syncopated hand claps, falsettos, oohs, and the galloping bass line that Paul claimed to have lifted, almost note for note, from Chuck Berry's album cut, I'm Talking About You. Do you want to know a secret? A song that Paul considered a bit of a hack song, really. And although the song showcased George's vocals, the tune was in part lifted from Disney's I'm Wishing from the film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Listen, do you want to know a secret?
I'm wishing for the one I love.
Paul stumbled through Hold Me Tight, which wasn't included on the album, and the rest of the songs the band just ripped through in order to give it that cavern live feel. Songs like Anna, Boys, Chains and Baby It's You. But they were short of one more track, and Norman Smith says that the rest of the band, somebody suggested Twist and Shout. The problem was John's voice was shot. This was a real larynx shredder, and it's obvious from the opening line that John's voice was tearing and straining for control.
Twist and shout, twist and shout. Come on, come on, come on, come on, baby.
Almost sounds more like a shriek than somebody singing. As regards the cover, George Martin was an honorary fellow of the Zoological Society of London, which owns London Zoo. He actually wanted some publicity photographs for the band posed outside the Insect House. The Beatles, do you get it? However, the Society turned down Martin's request, and instead Angus MacBean was asked to take the distinctive colour photograph of the group, looking down over the stairwell at EMI's London headquarters in Manchester Square. Please Please Me represents a perfect glimpse into this band's future, and whenever I play it, you're reminded of the powerful live act they were, and the band they were soon to become. As far as I'm concerned, there's no other album in pop music history that can match Please Please Me for its sheer sense of spontaneous excitement. And you'd watch a video by Classic Album Review. If you enjoyed this, please do share it, click like, subscribe, check that notification bell, do all that stuff. Other than that, I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.